Good morning. As been mentioned, we're going to be in Job, so go ahead and open your Bibles up to Job. But before we get there, I want to give a few flowers of gratitude. Again, this is an effort to not have regrets, but to make sure that I am expressing gratitude on a regular basis. This morning, I wanted to bring a few names before you. First of all, I hope we appreciate John Wilcox. You have got to get here probably by 8 a.m. to beat John to the building. But that is because he is here to make sure things are ready. Lights are on, doors are open, heat is correct, and he is faithful about that. And it is a big blessing to know that someone will be here to welcome people on a Sunday morning when we expect people to start showing up. And so, John, I really appreciate that work and that consistency. And, of course, he's going to act like it's no big deal. And then Scott Cahill, Loretta Yeagley, and Ben Powell. I can always rely on one of the three of them to send me an encouraging text. Sometimes it's after I get an opportunity to preach. Sometimes it's just for no particular reason. And I guarantee I'm not the only one. And that just means a lot. When you don't have any clue, or maybe you're just rushing through the day and then that text blows up and it's one of those three generally, and there's others, but one of those three consistently letting them know how much they appreciate you. So thank you for that. And I know we have a lot of people like that. And then completely not even related to the lesson this morning, an observation I made a few weeks ago that I just wanted to share with you. This is a McLaren P1. It has a top speed of 217 miles per hour. It goes 0 to 60 in 2.8 seconds, and it is about a 903 horse. Who's got one? I think it's about $1 million to $1.5 million. I didn't actually. Jeff Walker has two. So, what's the point? I saw one of these years ago back when we lived in Texas. We lived in the Woodlands, Texas. I don't know if you've ever been to the Woodlands, Texas. Brett and Stacy maybe. I know they've been in Texas roots. The Woodlands is a planned community where there's lots of speed bumps, lots of stoplights, and I think the maximum speed on the longest straight stretch is 45 miles an hour. This McLaren P1 was in the Woodlands, Texas. One more example. This is my daughter on her computer. A couple years, and I don't even know if those are the right things. I looked up the receipt and it had Dell Precision 570. I have no idea, and that's sort of part of the point. So my daughter's a computer science major, and when she was heading into Purdue, I talked to Eric Jones because he knows about computers and I don't. I said, what does she need? And he basically gave me 3 levels, and he goes, if she gets this thing, she'll probably never need anything at all. And I got her this, and he goes, that's better than the computers at the lab. And she's got one of her coding applications pulled up on there. I mean, this thing, I can't even describe to you what it is because that's how ignorant I am. I could do Excel on it. I could do PowerPoint, and I could check my emails. What's my point? A McLaren P1 is fine for driving around the Woodlands. It got him. I saw a gentleman get out of the car. It got him from where he was going, right? They were doing some shopping. Maybe they went over to get some Baskin-Robbins after. It worked, but is that really what the McLaren was designed for? Is that all it was designed for? Is that the most use of its design? Natalie's computer, I can do email and Excel spreadsheets and PowerPoint on. Is that what it was designed for? Think about the body of Christ here in Lafayette. What did God design us for? If this time on Sundays mornings is the only interaction we have with the body here, we are not using it to its full capabilities. If we keep what we do together inside these 4 walls, we are not using the body, the church as God designed it, to its full capabilities. We are blessed. We are blessed to have a thriving working body with many talents and much diversity. Please, I'm speaking to myself, let's use the body to its fullest potential as God designed it. That was free. Job. We're going to be extensively in Job this morning. In fact, as we wrap up 2022, that is the year, right? Wrapping up 2022, Matt had a neat idea. As we look back, we've been looking at foundations of faith and what does it look like to put faith in action and how do we support each other as we grow in our faith. He had 3 ideas of who we could look at to explore some of the things that we've gone over this year. Job obviously was one, and if I remember correctly, it was Ruth and Gideon is coming. Is that right, Matt? So Matt will explore Ruth and Gideon in the next couple of weeks as well. But any of these people, we can look and see how their faith was built and how it grew, and we can learn lessons from that. And this morning, we're going to be taking a look at Job, and not necessarily just the sufferings and the patience of Job, the endurance of Job. We're going to be looking at the fight of Job and hopefully taking away from that. Go ahead and turn to Job chapter 1. And again, let's just quickly look at the setup of this situation. In Job chapter 1, it begins, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless, upright, fearing God, and turning away from evil. Get used to that statement. You're going to hear it a couple more times. The opening line describes Job as blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. Then you get an idea of his wealth. He was a very wealthy man. Drop down to verse 6. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. Satan, the accuser, that's what that word means, the accuser. The accuser also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, "From where do you come?" Then Satan answered to the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." And the Lord said to Satan, here's number 2, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him in the earth, on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil." So not only does the book open with that statement, but here's God confirming, have you considered Job? There's nobody else like him. Blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. Satan, the accuser, verse 9. "Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge about him and his home and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But put forth your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face." Then the Lord said to Satan, the accuser, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not put forth your hand on him." So Satan departed from the presence of the Lord. And then we see, and if we're familiar, we just, again, try to remove that lens of we're so familiar with this text and just think of being Job and the heartbreak that ensues in verse 13. "Now on the day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, 'The oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding beside them, and the Sabeans attacked and took them, and they also slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I am alone have escaped to tell you.' While he was still speaking, another also came and said, 'The fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you.' And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, 'The Chaldeans formed 3 bands and made a raid on the camels and took them and slew the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you.' And while he was still speaking, another also came and said, 'Your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and behold, a great wind came up from across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they died. And I alone have escaped to tell you.'" My worst day, I cannot process that chain of events. My worst day, I can't process it. What's your worst day? Can you process it? And it's not just the loss of things. Every single report had the loss of life, culminating in the loss of his family, his children. And Job in verse 20 arose and tore his robe and shaved his head and fell on the ground and worshipped. And he said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. And the Lord gave, and the Lord has taken. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Though through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. So Satan's wrong. Satan's wrong. God 1, Satan 0. But that's not it, is it? You get into chapter 2, and the Lord said to Satan, verse 2, "Where have you come from?" Then Satan answered, and the Lord answered the Lord and said, "From roaming about on the earth and walking around on it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? For there is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause." That's the 3rd time Job, in these very short chapter and a half, or less than chapter and a half, has been called blameless and upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. And Satan answered, verse 4, and said, skin for skin, yes, all that the man has he will give for his life. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. So the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your power, only spare his life. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils, and from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd and scraped himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. And as if it wasn't enough, now it's his own flesh, his own health. And as if it wasn't enough, I read somewhere, sometimes someone dying is the easiest way to lose something. Now his wife is looking at him, and I think we give her a hard time, but she's been through loss as well. And she says, just curse God and die. Why are you still breathing? His response, verse 10, but he said to her, we're going to go ahead and read verse 10 through a little bit of chapter 3. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speak. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now when Job's 3 friends heard of all this adversity that had come upon him, they came each from his own place, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. And they made an appointment together to come to sympathize with him and comfort him. And when they lifted up their eyes at a distance, and they did not recognize him, they raised their voices and wept, and each of them tore his robe, and they threw dust over their heads toward the sky. And they sat down on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, with no one speaking a word to him. For they saw that his pain was very great. Just get the magnitude of this. His friends coming to comfort. They've heard. But even as you've heard all of it, once they see, I think it hits him even harder. It's one thing to hear it, it's another thing to see the person that is their friend in such pain and such sorrow and such deep, deep grief that they stop from afar, they can't even recognize him, and they weep. And they just sit beside him without saying a word for 7 days. And when Job finally opens his mouth, in verse 3, he says, let the day perish on which I was to be born, and let the night which said a boy is concerned. Let me read that again. Let the day perish on which I was to be born, and the night which said a boy is conceived. May that day be darkness. Let not God above care for it, nor light shine on it. Verse 11, why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? It's interesting that in God's discussion with the accuser, with Satan, and Satan comes back the second time. Well, I shouldn't even say Satan comes back. God brings Job up the second time. And Satan says, well, if I touch his flesh. And what does God say? He says, you can touch his flesh, just leave him alive. And what is Job's wish? I wish I'd never even been born. I think this part is hard, but yet also somewhat easy to connect with Job. There is, unless you have no conscience and no feelings and no ability to connect with other humans, there's a connection in suffering, isn't there? It's the same but different. Maybe not to the extent, maybe not to the depths, but we've all felt that kind of pain, that pain that takes our breath away. And that's the kind of pain, that overwhelming pain that Job is in. But then oftentimes we go, what? You read 1 and 2 and you say, God was the one that brought him up? I mean, what, this behind the scenes, I've heard people say it's like God's playing games. It's like a chess game. It's like, is that the loving and merciful God? It's interesting that in James 5, when Job is brought up, it says, look at Job as an example of endurance, patience and endurance. And the outcomings of the Lord are compassion and mercy. Does it seem in this text, in this limited view, how God is dealing with Job, that there's a lot of compassion and mercy? It doesn't. In fact, I think we come to this point, and oftentimes we are going to assume that we're going to start to learn why God lets people suffer. We're going to learn the purpose of suffering. And I've taught lessons as if I thought that's what the book taught, but that's not what the book of Job teaches. In fact, one way to look at the questions that are asked and answered is, first of all, is God just? Is God just? Does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And how do we explain Job's suffering? If you get in the mind of the individuals that we're going to be looking at and reading, Job and his friends, if you get in their mind, here's the questions, because they come to the situation with an assumption, with a core belief. The core belief is, why, if you're wise and good, if you live a life of wisdom and goodness, then you will have success and be rewarded. That's how God treats us. And if you live a life of evil and foolishness, you will have disaster and punishment. That is the underlying assumption that we see throughout. And we're going to look at that here in a second. And if that's your underlying assumption, and then you take somebody like Job, who we already read 3 times is blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil, then it raises significant problems. It raises questions like, well, then is God just? If Job is blameless and upright and this is what he's going through, then is God just? Okay, well, if God is just, but does God actually run the universe according to a strict principle of justice? Another way you could say that, is God competent to even run the universe based on justice? If this is what's happening to Job? So how do we explain Job's suffering? The book of Job is a beautiful example of Hebrew poetry, and what we're going to look at, and we're going to do this quickly, so buckle up. We're going to look, there's 3 cycles really of conversations in Elihu, which we're going to completely ignore, but it's not because of lack of willingness, it's because of lack of time. If you want to hear my ideas on Elihu, I'm more than happy to share them with you. But there's these 3 cycles. You have Job and his friends. And one way to look at these cycles of conversation is there's this argument. Job constantly saying, I'm innocent. And the friends constantly saying, God is just. You're going to see that when the friends say something like, the wicked perish. The perverted are judged. The innocent, the righteous, they flourish. But these 2 arguments, Job saying, I'm innocent. Is Job right? I mean, my goodness, we've read 3 times already in less than 2 chapters that he's blameless, upright, fears God, and turns away from evil. His friends saying God is just. The implication from Job's perspective, I'm innocent, that means what's happening to me cannot be divine judgment. I'm innocent. Job has the same belief system. We'll see that. If you're wise and you're good, then you will be rewarded and there will be success. If you're evil and you're foolish, you will be punished and there will be disaster. Job's sitting here knowing himself, knowing his innocence, looking at a situation going, this can't be, there's got to be something else going on. This can't be divine. I don't deserve this. His friends, on the other hand, are sticking hard and fast, and you're going to see it over and over. God runs the world by divine justice. That's how the world works. And the conclusions that we see is, you'll see very clearly, Job's friends say, Job's a sinner. That's the only rational conclusion based on how we understand this works. Job is a sinner. And what we'll find, and we're going to look at some of these, where Job struggles, is, well, maybe God doesn't run the world according to justice. Maybe, and there's implications of maybe God's incompetent. Maybe that's not how it's working. Or you're also going to see Job often, well, maybe God's not just. Maybe I've thought this whole time that God is a just God, and maybe He's not. And that's the battle that's going on. So if you will, buckle up with me. I'll leave this on. This is the last slide I believe that we have, but I'm going to go through some text. I'm going to go through rather quickly so that we can get some idea of how this conversation breaks out, so you can see this core belief system that his friends keep applying to his situation, and Job's struggling with it. Go ahead and turn to Job chapter 4. Eliphaz starts out, we're just going to read verses 1 through 6 to begin with. Eliphaz answered, if one ventures a word with you, so this is after Job is opened up, and he shared where he's at. Eliphaz says, if one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? Behold, you have admonished many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have helped the tottering to stand, and you have strengthened feeble knees. But now it has come to you, and you are impatient. It touches you, and you are dismayed. Is not your fear of God your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? Notice what happens. Eliphaz, rightly so, says, Job, you've sat where we've sat, looking at someone where you're sitting. And what did you do? You have helped and you have strengthened and you have come to the aid of people whose God's judgment is raining down on them. And now that it's come to you, you're questioning it? I mean, Job has been in the very situation with the same belief system, holding others accountable to it. And all of that says, now that you're in this situation, look where he goes in verse 7. Remember now, whoever perished being innocent, or where were the upright destroyed? According to what I have seen, those who plow iniquity and those who sow trouble harvest it. Where have we seen it, Job? Restating this basic core assumption, this core belief that the wicked get punished, the righteous will be rewarded. Where have you seen it? Job, you understand these things. Job's response in chapter 6, and there's a lot to it, but notice in beginning in verse 24. Chapter 6, verse 24. Teach me, and I will be silent, and show me how I have erred. How painful are honest words, but what does your argument prove? Do you intend to reprove my words when the words of the one in despair belong to the wind? You would even cast lots for the orphans and barter over your friend. Now please look at me and see if I lie to your face. Desist now. Let there be no injustice. Even desist. My righteousness is yet in it. Is there injustice on my tongue? Cannot my palate discern calamities? These are his friends. He's saying, look at me. Am I lying? If what you're saying, if I was wicked, then yes, I would agree with you. But he's saying, do I not even get a moment of consideration that I'm telling the truth? Look at me. Bildad, chapter 8, verse 1. Bildad. We could read verse 1. Does God pervert justice, or does the Almighty, verse 2, pervert what is right? If your sons sinned against him, then he delivered them into the power of their transgression. Isn't that a comforting statement? Still reeling over the loss of your children, and Bildad says, well, they must have sinned. They got what was coming to them. Notice verse 5. If you would seek God and employ the compassion of the Almighty, if you are pure and upright, surely now he would rouse himself for you and restore your righteous estate. Though your beginning was insignificant, yet your end will increase greatly. Notice where Bildad, he says, repent, seek God, admit what you've done wrong, and God will restore you. He will forgive you. Job in chapter 9, verse 1, he says, in truth, I know that this is so, referring to what Bildad said. But how can a man be in the right before God? If one wished to dispute with him, he could not answer him once in 1,000 times. Wise in heart and mighty in strength, who has defied him without harm? Job's saying, I know what you're saying. See, what Job is struggling with is he has sat in his friend's place looking at people just like him and telling them to repent. Telling them this is God's judgment. Telling them that God will return to them if he returns to him, if they return to him. But yet, he's looking at his life and all that goes into how he views the world and how he views God, and it doesn't make sense. And he's trying to profess his innocence. Even you start to see this, how he's calling for this audience with God. He goes, how can I even have this discussion with God? How can I bring my case before him? We're going to see a little bit later. I know what you're saying is true. Chapter 11, verse 1. Zophar chimes in. So we're getting towards the end of cycle 1. Shall a multitude of words go unanswered, and the talkative man be acquitted? You start to see a theme, don't you? Shall your boast silence men, and shall you scoff and none rebuke? Notice, jump down in verse 5. But would that God might speak and open his lips against you. Job has asked for an audience. He wants God to tell him what he's done. And Zophar's like, I wish God would. We know there's something. We know you're a sinner. We know you're a sinner because of the punishment that we're seeing, the suffering that we're seeing. We know you're a sinner. We're not going to go through every single cycle. There's just too much. It's interesting that in chapter 15 it becomes more of the same. I do want you to look at chapter 16 to see Job's response. There's something interesting in chapter 16. Job says, verse 4, he says, I too could speak like you if I were in your place. I could compose words against you and shake my head at you. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips could lessen your pain. Notice the difference. He goes, if I was in your spot, I could do the same thing. I could point, and I could accuse, and I could shake my head at you. But notice in verse 5, I could also ease your pain with words. And as you read, and we're not going to get to all this, but as you read, there's these statements where if Job just wants somebody to listen. He just wants somebody to listen. You can look at chapter 18, verse 4, Bildad. He says, are you the exception? I say it that way. Look at verse 4. He says, oh, you who tear yourself in your anger, for your sake is the earth to be abandoned or the rock to be moved from its place? It's like, oh, you're the exception. We're going to just throw out what we know to be true because you're suffering, but you're innocent. I mean, you see this dogmatic certainty that they have about the way things work. The same certainty that Job had about the way things worked. Chapter 20, just a couple more of these real quickly. Chapter 20, verse 4. I just want you to see how they phrase this. So this is Zophar. Look at verse 4. Do you know this from of old, from the establishment of man on earth, that the triumphing of the wicked is short and that the joy of the godless is momentary? Notice it. This is the way it's always. You see how set in stone this thought process is? Do you know that this is how it's always been? The wicked are going to be punished. It's momentary. It's interesting in this response in chapter 21, and there's other places, but specifically look at chapter 21, verse 7 through 9. As Job's responding, he says, why do the wicked still live, continue on and become very powerful? Their descendants are established with them in their sight, and their offspring before their eyes. Their houses are safe from fear, and the rod of God is not on them. So as they keep saying, pointing the wicked, he goes, hey, wait a minute. We know that this principle is not carried out in every circumstance. There are wicked people that are powerful. There are wicked people that are thriving. You start to see how Job is working through his certainties. He's working through that assumption, that core belief, as his friends just keep hammering on him and hammering on him. And it's more of the same and more of the same. And finally in chapter 22, which I'm not going to read, Eliphaz gets to some direct accusations. Not necessarily because he has proof. But he just starts talking about the poor and the widowed and the downtrodden and how Job has cheated people and all these other things. You can read he gets more. It's not just these general wickedness statements. It's like, no, Job, you've done these things. And it's also interesting as you see Job, he starts addressing them less and less and just starts going right to God. So this principle is quite clear. How his friends look at the world, how Job looked at the world, and now it's being applied to Job, who has 3 times in the book been called innocent, he's been called blameless, upright, fearing God, turning away from evil. And his friends can't even consider an alternative, and Job is struggling to understand what's going on. In fact, I want to quickly look, and we're going to go back to chapter 6. We're going to go through a few passages again. I want us to see the struggle. I picked just a few select passages so we can help feel the struggle of Job, and then we'll get to the God's response and the conclusion. Go ahead and turn to chapter 6, verse 8. And I'm going to read these quickly, not a whole lot of commenting on each one. Chapter 6, verse 8. Oh, that my request might come to pass, and that God would grant my longing. Would that God were willing to crush me, that he would loose his hand and cut me off. So his longing is for God to just end it. Verse 10, but it is still my consolation, and I rejoice in unsparing pain, that I have not denied the words of the Holy One. See, his relationship with God is still forefront. He's still desperately seeking to understand. We're going to see that a couple more times. What is my strength? Verse 11. What is my strength that I should wait? And what is my end that I should endure? Is my strength the strength of stones, or is my flesh bronze? Is it that my help is not within me and that deliverance is driven from me? He's saying, I don't know why I'm alive. I don't know where this strength is coming from. I should be dead. I'm asking God to end this. But yet he's still clinging that he hasn't denied the words of the Holy One. Flip over to chapter 7, verse 16. I waste away, I will not live forever. Leave me alone, for my days are but a breath.
What is man that you magnify him, and that you are concerned about him, that you examine him every morning and try him every moment? Will you never turn your gaze from me, nor let me alone until I swallow my spittle? Have I sinned? What have I done to you, O watcher of men? Why have you set me as your target so that I am a burden to myself? Why then do you not pardon my transgression and take away my iniquity? For now I will lie down in the dust, and you will seek me, but I will not be.
This is not someone who thinks he's perfect. We'll see a few times he looks to God for forgiveness, for deliverance from his transgressions, for pardoning his sin. But he feels like he's got this target on him and he doesn't understand, and he's saying, show me exactly what I've done. Pardon me. Chapter 9, verse 17. For he bruises me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not allow me to get my breath, but saturates me with bitterness. If it is a matter of power, behold, he is the strong one. If it's a matter, it's like, if we're in a fight, if we're trying to prove who's strongest, he's won. And if it's a matter of justice, who can summon him? If it's a matter of who's just, I can't call God to task. I can't call and hold him accountable for something I think is unjust. Verse 20, though I am righteous, my mouth will condemn me. Though I am guiltless, he will declare me guilty. I am guiltless. I do not take notice of myself. I despise my life. It is all one. Therefore I say, he destroys the guiltless and the wicked. You see how he's struggling. He's trying to make sense of it. His assumptions, his belief system is not making sense. It's being turned on its head. And he's like, is God, he's just throwing the guiltless and the wicked all in one big pile. We can go on and on and on. In chapter 10, which I had Eric read, the end of chapter 9, chapter 10, it's heartbreaking as he calls for an umpires. I just want an audience. I want somebody to decide between us. And he gets into chapter 10, and as he goes on in chapter 10 and verse 8, he talks about how frail he is, about how God, you know what I've made of. You know of what I'm made of. I am not made of the stuff that can stand up and compete with you. You almost, it's like, why am I the target? And you see the heartache, and you see the confusion, and you see the pain. In chapter 13, though, look at this phrase he still has in chapter 13 as he's struggling. In chapter 13, let's go ahead and start reading. Now, this is just after, at the beginning of chapter 13, he's basically said to his friends, look, are you arguing for God? Are you the ones that are doing God's injustice? As you sit here and accuse me? He says in verse 13, be silent before me so that I may speak. Then let come on me what may. Why would I take my flesh in my teeth and put my life in my hands? Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. This also will be my salvation, for a godless man may not come before his presence. Though he slay me, in the midst of all this, he says, I'm still going to hope in him. I'm going to verbalize this confusion, this complaint, but I'm going to hope in him. Not much later, he calls God he's his Redeemer, even in the midst of it. In chapter 23, and I'm not going to read that for time's sake, but you can see where he starts to say, I've got my case prepared. I want to argue my case. Just give me a chance. And we read that and we consider who God is, and we're like, I don't know that I would ever have the boldness to say to God, I got my case. Finally, in chapter 31, Job ends by in detail declaring his innocence. And his friends in chapter 32, verse 1, just give up because Job sees himself as righteous in his own eyes. And that's that battle. And there's a lot more that I could have read. There's a lot more that you would get out of it if you read Job's statements in their entirety. And you would see the struggle, the confusion, the times when Job calls into question God's justice, when Job calls into question his competence to deal out justice. All trying to make sense of how he views God, how his belief system applies justice and mercy, reward and punishment. As he sits there in dust and ashes, scraping the boils with a potsherd, mourning the loss of his wealth and his family and his wife. and his friends. And then we get to chapter 38, excuse me. There is no 48. When God answers Job out of a whirlwind, and we're not going to read much of this at all. I'm just going to give you a synopsis, and this is worth going back to read. It's verse 38. God answers Job out of a whirlwind. He says, verse 2, Who is this that darkens my counsel? Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. And God just starts peppering him with questions. Where were you? Tell me. And it goes from this origins of the universe to the order of the universe, all the way down to taking care of the creation, where this gets its food and how this gives birth and all the details. And in chapters 38 through 39, you have this response from God to the accusations Job's made. The accusation, maybe God isn't just, or maybe God doesn't run the world by justice, or maybe he's incompetent to do such a thing. And God, in such detail, gives him a virtual tour of the origins and order of all things. And here's what we got to understand. Go back to that big assumption, that they have, right? That assumption that if you're wise and you're good, that you're going to be rewarded. If you're foolish and you're evil, you're going to be punished. There's an underlying assumption under there, isn't there? That's a base assumption. That's a belief system. But under there, Job and his friends think that they have a big enough perspective to understand and to make claims about how God should deal out death and judgment, reward and punishment, justice. And God in chapter 38 and 39 is saying, you don't see the half of it. So Job makes these claims, his friends make these claims, they have this assumption built on this underlying assumption that they know what's going on in the first place. God says you don't. And in chapter 40, you see Job's response. Behold, I am insignificant. What can I reply to you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, I will not answer, even twice, and I will add nothing more. And then God's not quite finished. If you look at the verses all the way down to verse 14, I think what God's doing now is, okay, you want to hand out justice? You want to dictate who gets rewarded and who gets punished? You want to sit in the judgment seat? Take it on, Job. You want to be God for a day? How are you going to run the universe from a throne of justice? What's that look like, Job? And again, we don't have time for Behemoth and Leviathan. I have some thoughts on that. Ask me later if you want to know. But as Job is struggling, as he's working to understand, as he's challenging his own assumption, his own certainty, and he's drawing the conclusions about who God is, God doesn't even deal with that absolutely. He says, you don't even have a glimpse of what's going on. And Job's response in chapter 42, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore, I have declared that which I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask you, and you instruct me. I have heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. I thought I knew who you were. I thought I knew how things worked. I thought I understand this world. I didn't know anything. But I'm now listening. And he says in verse 6, therefore I retract and I repent in dust and ashes. I'm going to deal with this very quickly. I don't want to give you the idea that I don't think there's a repentant heart in Job. I think as he retracts. But it's interesting to me that Hebrew word for repent in verse 6 is used, that exact word is used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 other times in the book of Job alone. I'll read these quickly. Job 2:11, Job 7:13, Job 16:2, that's 2:11, 7:13, 16:2, 21:34, 29:25, and then in the same chapter, 42 verse 11. Look at 42 verse 11. It says, then all his brothers and his sisters, and all who had known him before, came to him, and they ate bread with him in his house, and they consoled him and comforted him. Every single time that word is translated in the book of Job, it's comforted, not repented. It's used in other books as repented. That's a proper translation at times. But in Job, every other time that word's used, it's comforted. Think of Job's response if you change comforted. I retract, and I'm comforted in dust and ashes. That idea of dust and ashes, you see that actually in chapter 30, verse 16 and 23. Write this one down, Genesis 18, 27, when God is going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham is daring to speak to God. He goes, I am but dust and ashes, but I'm going to ask. It's not a repentance thing, it's a mortality thing. I'm just dust and ashes. So picture this. Job has had everything stripped away from him. After everything stripped away in chapter 1 and 2, he's left with nothing but his belief system and his confusion about how he applies that belief system. And he struggles, and his aim is at God, and God's not doing it right, or God's not just, or he's not dealing out justice the way he should. And God finally strips that away from him, and Job is left with nothing except God himself. And he says, I'm comforted. And from the first time that we see this whole scenario start, he's comforted. For the first time. His wife doesn't do it. His friends don't do it. Sorry, comforters are you all. And for the first time, when everything is finally stripped away, even his presumptions, his presuppositions, his belief system about how he thought the world worked and who God was, then he's comforted. Last very quick point, and then I'm going to make quick observations and we're done. I appreciate you sticking with me. 42 verse 7, look what happens after. It came about after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, my wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, because you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now he's not saying I don't believe that everything Job said was right. But he's saying Job understands me. You were set and you were certain and you were accusing. You made assumptions about who Job was, even though God had said 3 times, I know they didn't hear that, but God said 3 times the quality and character of this man. And yet you kept attacking. Job said what was right because Job struggled and he fought to understand and he drew nearer and nearer to me even when it didn't make sense. Job said what was right. Here's the observations and I'll be done. Was Job's belief system wrong? Was it faulty? Was it inaccurate? Was it incomplete? Absolutely. When he held a faulty, incomplete, inaccurate belief system, did God call him blameless? Did God call him innocent? There's a lesson there, people. There's a lesson in me trying and struggling and still not quite understanding, but yet God's grace can call me blameless and upright, even when I'm not even looking at him as complete and as full as I should be. There's grace. Chapter 42, he said, Job spoke what was right. It's the struggle. It's the fight. It's not, and this is the hard part, it's not knowing why things are happening. It's knowing the God we trust in better. It's a natural tendency to want to know why, to get purpose and meaning out of suffering, out of trials, out of hardships. But faith is built when we come to know the God of all things through those suffering, through that trial. It's not the knowing why, it's knowing the God more accurately. And sometimes it's only the suffering and it's only the trial and it's only the pain that will peel things back so that we can see him more clearly. Sometimes it's our very own presuppositions, our own belief systems that get in the way of us seeing God more clearly. And then finally, Job said, I am comforted in dust and ashes. It scares me to death sometimes that I might have faith enough to some point. This sounds strange, but it scares me to death to think that there could be a time in my life I have a strong enough faith that God says to the accuser, have you considered my servant Andy? Terrifies me. Because when he strips everything away, when he strips my comfort away, when he strips my safety away, when he strips my health and my wealth and my relationships away, and then at the end, when I'm grasping to understand and hold on, and he strips away my certainty and that core belief system that I held on for so long, and I'm left with nothing except him, will I still be there, comforted by God alone? I believe that's the true challenge of the book of Job, is not the why, not even the setup. It's the struggle and the fight to know God more fully. And that always takes the stripping away of those things that I hold dear, those things that I think are important. And that's the foundation of faith. Stripping away and putting God in their place. I appreciate your attention. If there's anything that we can do for you this morning, if you need the prayers of the congregation or if you want to put on Christ, we can make that available now as we stand and sing.